Chapter 4. Warrior of the Aspect can cultivate a life for 5 million years, then cast it away on a single charge. Their infinitely precious spirits must only be expended on an infinitely dangerous enemy. The Book of Mournful Night. Curling threads of dimensional bleed twisted out of the Tesseract labyrinth, its prismatic light difficult to look upon. And out of it stepped Trazyn the Infinite, tile cloak shifting and clicking as he marched from the rift. Followed by another Trazyn, and another. Rank upon rank of overlords wielding war scythes, their hooked blades shouldered like warriors of old on the campaign road. They formed two lines, heedless of the battle raging behind them where Necron tore at Necron. "I have most certainly had this nightmare before," said Orokin, 2 fingers hooking a unit glyph on his Foss tablet and dragging them into the combat. "Repeatedly." "Thought this could be dangerous, and I might need a surrogate," said Trazyn. "Brought 10 instead. Pre-formatted Lich-Guard, so there's no time lost in structural reconfiguring. Better to be over-prepared, eh? 3 of you," he snapped. "Secure Master Orokin. The rest disperse to the battlefront. I want the option of jumping wherever it's needed." "You are, as they say, going in?" "Well, your hands are a bit full by playing Nemesaur, are they not? I'll leave a slither of consciousness here to deploy the labyrinths in case we need to plug the line and launch a counterattack if we're able. Deploy them too soon, and the deceiver may turn them as well. We should destroy those smaller shards first." He tapped a tattoo on the haft of his obliterator. "Conventional weapons are not working. Perhaps an unconventional one would make a dent." "Trazyn," said Orokin, faltered as he turned away to run a re-ranking program on a unit of decimated immortals. "Fair stars." And with a rush of distortion, Trazyn's consciousness streamed through the ether and towards the fighting. Trazyn's spirit algorithm flashed above the steel ranks, reading the battlefield Orokin was casting to him through the tactical combat network. To the far left, a group of Lich-Guard stood against the flare charge, their locked formation of dispersion shields and long war scythes slowly eroding under the beating tides of corrupted metal. They would hold for now. In the center, one of the Deceiver shards led a charge into a unit of vulnerable warriors, the shard sheltering behind an advancing wall of dispersion shields and corrupted Lich-Guard. The warriors could take a toll as long as the enemy were kept at bay. They would shatter as soon as the charge hit home. To his right, burning arcs lit the walls of the cavern, tacking and trading fire like a starship battle in miniature. Doomsday cannons pulverized the air as they fired, beams crossing in their 3-dimensional dances of evasion. Above them, tomb blades, corkscrewed and skidded in an aerial dogfight, their dimensional repulsors pulling vector thrust maneuvers that would kill a mortal pilot. "Orokin," he asked. "Battle line takes priority, but—" The Astromancer paused, and Trazyn knew he was plugging logic problems into the arc battle. "But if we lose air superiority, they will be upon us." "Understood. I may be able to help with that." He sent an interstitial command for one of his surrogates to get in position below the dogfight, and another to the one handling the Tesseract vaults. Then he crashed his consciousness into a surrogate and barreled his way through the rear rank of warriors, knocking them asunder. One he ran directly over, treading on its prone back and using the purchase of its spine to give him a last burst of momentum. His empathic obliterator flared, the energies of ancient cosmic powers, the powers of living gods, burning around it like a torch. A Lich-Guard saw the obliterator swing down and brought its shield up to catch the blow. "Awake or die!" Trazyn shouted, as the obliterator smashed down. Trazyn felt the bladed head of his weapon strike the tall shield, saw the dispersion field that sheathed it flash as it bowed inward, his hyper-focused vision catching the microsecond explosion as the field shattered into fractals and disappeared. Ethereal energy slammed into the corrupted guards, frying neural connections and fusing limbs. It boiled outward in a cone, throwing solid guards from their feet, blackening ivory-inlaid armor, its thunderclap shockwave blasting a crested head from a guard's spine. Behind the ranks, the Deceiver Shard raised a hand, sheltering its snarling eyes from the discharge, temporarily blinded by the star-bright energy of the ancient weapon. There was a hole in the Lich Guard wall. Warriors, unthinking and unstoppable, still following a containment command issued 60 billion years before, forced open the gap and lowered their flares at the fallen god. Orokin pumped coolant fluid through his golden headdress, increasing the amount of heat he could bleed off his neural matrix and disperse through the hood-like thermal regulator. He'd never run his system this hot before. Condensation from his deep-cold headdress ran down the veins, sweat-like, and sizzled as it met his cranium. Orokin was used to deep focus, meditation, channeling all his effort into one task, other protocols running in the background. This was like that cursed space battle so many centuries ago. His focus fragmented and scattered, leaping from crisis to crisis. "In the beginning, all matter was in one point," he repeated to himself, hoping the mantra would keep him centered. "All was quiet before creation. All was quiet." Battle management was, he realized, not his forte. And if he continued running hot too long, he would begin to burn engrams, losing memories and mental processes, frying millennia of hex study and arcane knowledge. All the knowledge that made up Orokin the Diviner, gone like scrolls on a pyre. "All was quiet in the beginning. All matter in one point. Bastard!" The Tombblade he was tracking tumbled from the vaults. He was simultaneously running a ground-based defense on the left, ensuring the Lich Guard and Immortals formed and maintained optimal defensive strategies, while rerouting units to the center, where Trazyn fought a desperate melee to hold the line against one of the two shards. He was also assigning target priorities on the right, where 2 units of Immortals were trying to hold back the second shard, as it threatened to break out and speed towards Orokin himself. He seconded a hunt of deathmarks to exterminate their corrupted fellows who lurked in the ruins of the Tesseract Vault, stepping out of their oubliette to cut down unit commanders, even as Orokin issued them new orders. On the right, the stricken Tombblade plunged, its system shorted by a dual Tesla carbine blast. It slammed down into the belly of a ghost ark, its neon-bright detonation bursting through the undercurve of the assault boat, which slewed sideways and drifted, self-repair systems struggling to keep it aloft. Directing the dogfight above was the most taxing problem. The single-seat Tombblades appeared simple enough, but their omnidirectional vector thrust engines and spherical flight dynamics meant they had a theoretically infinite envelope, able to turn, roll, viff and reverse direction at will. The hyperfractal algorithms that govern their flight patterns and angles of attack took all of Orokin's computational ability to predict, and still the precision of blade against blade was like a fencing duel between two masters. Each misstep, no matter how imprecise, led to a wound. "Trazyn!" he signaled. "We are losing the aerial battle. Half of our blades are down." "I have my own problems, colleague," Trazyn snapped back. Orokin refocused. The remaining blades were scored with luminous wounds of Gauss weapons and particle beams, yet another variable in the complex dance of unforgiving combat mathematics. To keep it all in the air, he dialed back his chronosense to a dangerous slowness. He'd had to cast himself back along the timeline twice to prevent the Doomsday Arcs breaking through and taking a shot at his command post. a desperate action that did little to help his heat problem. Yet what truly pushed him to the limit was countering the Deceiver. Its main form, at least 3 shards, Orokin was now sure, levitated at a distance behind the lines, buzzing with energy, hands extended. Through his dimensional gaze, Orokin could see a web of dark particles stretching from each extended finger to the corrupted. Each twitch of a finger was a mental command. Orokin could feel the push of the corruption on the minds of the Tomb Guardians, the cloying voice urging the uncorrupted to join the slaughter, turn on their allies. Here and there, a dozen pairs of frost-blue oculars flipped to amber. "Not so fast," Orokin growled, and forced through another security key. The eyes flipped back to blue. He was having to rewrite security protocols on the fly to stop the Deceiver from bypassing or subverting them. Thankfully, it appeared there would be no more flares. The Deceiver could bring out the blight, if it was already latent, it appeared, but not inflict it. An interstitial message from Trazyn appeared, but now Orokin could not spare the bandwidth to receive it. Too much was happening at once. He needed to establish a triage, to delegate, to trust. Let Trazyn handle the center. Focus his energy on the crucial flanks and air battle. Learn to compartmentalize each problem, not let one intrude on the other. Right now, his vision grid was split so many ways, scrying through so many eyes. His mind's eye was like the kaleidoscope vision of an insect. But if he let one thing slip, in the edge of his senses, barely noticeable by his perception suite, he realized the Trazyn surrogate. No, the partial Trazyn consciousness was saying something. "What?" he snapped, arms spread wide, juggling 9 discrete battle sectors and 46 contingency plans. "Name where you want suppressing fire," said the surrogate, a tesseract in its hand. "Left flank," Orokin said. The surrogate activated the tesseract and handed it to another false Trazyn. It sprinted towards the battle line and heaved towards a viewing platform that had previously held a Stone Lord and his Lich Guard, the noble phalanx currently drowning under crashing waves of flayed ones. The gossamer prismatic light, curling and flapping like strands of silk caught in a wind, bloomed on the high space. Objects moved in the depths of the dimensional rip. And, when Orokin saw what they were, he disconnected his overstretched consciousness from that battle sector with an uttered oath that conveyed, if anything, pure relief. Now, he merely had 8 sectors to manage. Trazyn caught a war-scythe blow on the haft of his obliterator and parried, driving the crackling twin-bladed headpiece of his staff forward into the space between the Lich Guard's shoulder armor and jaw. For a microsecond, the corrupted guard tried to fight back, hands melting as it wrestled with the superheated metal of the glaive. Then Trazyn ended it with a vicious twist that wrenched the Necron's head from its vertebrae. "Come, fallen gods! Destroy me! I have broken your kind before!" His perception suite blared an incoming warning, and he stepped back, trusting the Time-Splinter cloak to choose a future where he was not bisected by a phase blade. The striking Lich Guard, wearing an antique cranial decoration that looked like a crouching arachnid, overcommitted, and Trazyn grabbed the rim of his shield. He hauled the guard out of rank and sent him sprawling into the warriors behind. "Take him, please." A dozen skeletal hands caught the Lich Guard in grip so vice-like that it left indentations in his necrodermis. His back arched as an axe bayonet thrust out of his chestplate. Trazyn marvelled. He was turning the tide. Intervening, fighting the central advance to a standstill. 2 warriors were falling for every corrupted Lich Guard, but by joining the combat, he'd even the odds. He spun, a scythe blade glancing off his ribcage before he could get clear. He planted a metal foot into the guard's pelvic shielding and shoved, sending the guard staggering backward. When he tried to close again with two of his fellows, Trazyn threw a stasis field that halted them in place, defenseless, as a tide of warriors surged forward and began pulling limbs from their bodies. Yet a glance at the battlefield suggested that this sector was the exception, and largely holding due to the number of warriors committed. The Lich Guard, on the right, were crumbling before a unit of corrupted immortals. Orokin estimated they would break through in 2 to 5 minutes. The situation in the air was dire. More battle of attrition than dogfight. Worst of all, the warriors on the left were about to be overwhelmed, releasing hundreds of virus-infected flayers into their rear.
"You wish for me, child Trazyn,"
it said, Floor quivering with its voice.
"I am here."
And then the Deceiver Shard joined the melee. It tore into the rear ranks of its own Lich Guard, crushing and throwing them to the side to reach the Guardian warriors. Its electric talons, unbounded by necrodermis, shriveled warriors to ash with a touch, and tore open rib cages like hatches. Physics did not appear to have any power over it, streaming like conducted energy one moment and solid as a statue the next. Trazyn watched as it carved through warriors with contemptuous grace, tearing away limbs and severing spines with hatchet-like chops of its hands, backhanding warriors bodily into the air. It grabbed a warrior's cranium and crushed it one-handed.
"Perhaps, once free, I will pay a call on Solemnis, ensure that not even an atom remains."
The doomed warriors fired and stabbed, clutched at its levitating feet with broken hands, yet they passed right through it. It reminded Trazyn of Orokin in his empowered form. Is this what he saw as the future of the Necrons? This awful behemoth? "Stand aside," he ordered. He would not lose warriors to this unfit deity. "Engage the Lich Guard. Leave this Star-Eater to me." Warriors stepped back, clearing a lane, and Trazyn pointed his obliterator in challenge.
"Your forces fall. Your ally fails you. Even now, the flayed tear through the flank and will soon be at your back. Do you wish for an honorable death, child Trazyn? I shall not give you one."
Trazyn received a deployment alert and felt a petty sort of satisfaction. "Clever, Longskull, tempting me to check the battlefield. Yet the problem with a nickname like the Deceiver is that beings might be disinclined to trust you. As for our forces being defeated..." A new sound tore through the antechamber, one entirely different from the shriek of Gauss weaponry or the snap of particle beams. This was a chattering, a hammering, industrial and violent, the sound of mechanized brutality that could only come from one species. It was the sound of heavy bolters. The Deceiver swiveled its head right, taking in the streams of tracer fire pounding at the ranks of the victorious flayed ones. Shells as wide as a fist detonated into the crowded flare pack as it milled atop the slain warriors on the left flank. Long-bladed fingers dropped looted exoskeleton parts and armor plating, shrieking and hissing at the leaden death that had descended upon them. Two burst, spraying yellow fluid as the twin-fire tattoo of an autocannon blasted them into ruin. When the Deceiver looked back, Trazyn was already upon it, obliterator burning. It raised a stretched, overlong arm, and ancient artifact met C'tan's spirit with a crack of thunder. Chapter 5. "Lord General, show me an island and my guardsmen will take it. It is not a question of victory or defeat. It is a question of how many waves you are willing to lose." Lord General Mekahan, Serenade Maritime Infantry. Hands-fed ammunition bolts, gun housings rotated on ball mounts, oiled bolts pistoned backward, throwing shell casings at a rate of 3 per second. Each spiraled in the air, hollow end smoking like a flicked low stick, and landed with a tick-tick-tick on the strange black flagstones. Lieutenant Curtis Walea felt that nagging sense again. It was connected to the floor, which felt cold and oddly smooth under his knees. The Xenos cult had chosen summer to rise in Serenade City, and in the monsoon climate of the archipelago, that meant the trade winds reversed, bringing dust and heat smoke. The 4th Maritime Infantry Regiment had been in their summer uniforms, sleeves shortened in tight rolls, thin material to aid breathability, cloth-covered helmets to keep the metal from heating in the sun.
"Squad Beta, walk fire left 6 degrees,"
he shouted into his microbead.
3 short bursts.
He watched as Squad Beta, Mola, his best shooter, swung her chunky weapon around, pounding shots into a knot of metal horrors that had analyzed the fire pattern and tried to dash through a hole. They tore apart, shedding parts like broken toys. In his protective earbeads, the heavy bolter spoke with a muffled bleat, while the cigar-sized bullet casings struck the flagstones with a sharp ring. Malaya didn't know how in the hell the Xenos cult had created cybernetic furies, but by unnatural hunch he suspected the Gene Stealers had corrupted a Mechanicus outpost. That made the most sense out of anything. Not that he had time to consider the niceties. By the Emperor, he didn't even remember how they got here. All he knew was that these blasphemous xenoforms needed to die.
"Break out right," he warned. "Big Xenos with shields. Squad Jasmine."
The autocannon ploughed shots towards the new threat, flare leaping a foot from the barrel as it recoiled backward.
Womp womp. Womp womp. "Target's down. Reloading."
The loader grabbed a magazine of bottle-sized shells, tips painted blue.
Hey, not those," Walea pointed. "The anti-armor. You think we're still fighting mutants? Analyze, soldier."
He turned, surveyed the battlefield. In a strictly tactical sense, he should be securing his flanks, but a whisper in the back of his brain said he need not bother. His allies were handling it for now. Secure your own sector. Everything is fine.
"Heavy platoon, attend this. They're regrouping. Fire pattern Saurian. Even squads, suppress 30 seconds. Odd squads reload. Change barrels. Stage ammunition for next wave. In 30 seconds, we switch."
It was going to be a long engagement, but instinct told him that things were going well. Orokin punched his fist through a Fosscliff panel in frustration. Things were not going well. A soldier might be forgiven for thinking that, even a general, but Orokin wasn't any of those things. He was a chronomancer, and, just as important, a data interpreter of unusual abilities. They were getting some of their own back, it was true, holding, causing casualties, stopping an advance that, by right, they should not be stopping. But that didn't matter, because the Deceiver did not care about losing troops. The corrupted were nothing to the Star God but ablative armor, a shield. So long as the corrupted armor reduced their own forces while keeping the Deceiver's own incorporeal body safe, it will have done its job. The Deceiver did not want to walk out of this tomb at the head of an army. Its entire object was to kill Trazyn and Orokin, then escape. And it was well on the way. Orokin's battlefield projections made that clear. At this rate, even in the most optimistic scenarios, the armies of Necrons would wipe each other out within minutes. And when that happened, the Deceiver would simply tear Trazyn and Orokin apart, likely taking its time with it, then walk free. They were no match for it without an army. Trazyn, at least, was taking sensible action, no doubt gambling that the arcane artifact in his obliterator could damage the Star Gods better than traditional Necron weapons. But even if they could destroy the cast-off shards, what about the Master Shard? In fact, what happened when they destroyed the corrupted army and it had no reason to use most of its power as a puppeteer? He did not have time to postulate. A Tombblade signaled that it had a microsecond firing solution on an enemy, and Orokin had to take direct control, calculations scrolling across his vision as he tried to predict the flight path of the vectoring craft. "Trazyn," he signaled. "We need everything. Deploy everything!" The Star God struck out barehanded, fingers unspooling into 10-foot electric lashes that slapped the Blackstone to Trazyn's right, throwing up sparks. The C'tan danced forward, whirling, and lashed down again to his left. It was only thanks to the cloak that Trazyn was not badly hit. But the cloak tiles were glowing like embers. The Deceiver Shard's every blow was mortal, the need for the chrono sorcery constant. One solid hit from its lashing tendrils, and it could shatter him to pieces. Trazyn had heard Orokin's message, but there was not much he could do at present. If he paused to issue orders to his surrogate, he would be dead before he finished the thought. The finger whips came down again, and he threw the haft of his obliterator in the way, immediately seeing his mistake. One finger whip wrapped his obliterator, and the fallen deity dragged him forward into the grip of its other hand.
"Come, young one, to your punishment. I will shatter you into
Trazyn could not finish the insult, because the deceiver reached forward and tore away his jaw. Actuators worked, tortured and squealing. Sounds gurgled in hydraulic fluid. Tendrils sprouted from the Deceiver Shard's form, wrapping and pinning his arms, tossing the obliterator away. Coils, moving like lightning but piercing as a necrodermis spike, drove into his ribcage. Alerts flashed and blared as he felt his entire chest plate crack inward. The personal cartouche on his sternum pulverized and driven into his body cavity. The searching, razor-tipped coils lit him up inside with a sensation Trazyn had not felt since an age when stars fell and gods walked. It confused him, made him question what kind of malfunction this C'tan had wrought. But then the tendrils gored deeper into his systems, and the sensation overwhelmed him so thoroughly that the term came unbidden to his neural matrix.
"Pain,"
said the deceiver, its full lips twisting upward, and while the Master Shard's teeth were pointed, Trazyn saw that this one had stubby, short teeth, the colour of Promethium crude.
"This is pain. Did you not hope Nepereth could put you in bodies of flesh, my child, so you could once again experience sensation?"
Trazyn struggled, tried to look towards his fallen obliterator, but a tendril snaked into his metal hood and around his throat, immobilizing his damaged neck actuators.
"Don't you dare look away,"
the deceiver snarled. There was no hint of the mock roguishness. All cleverness had fled. All that remained was a depthless malice, a need to cause suffering that, were it to occur in a mortal creature, would have been labelled as pathological. But there was nothing abnormal about this Deceiver Shard. Cruelty was the natural state of the C'tan, and Trazyn could only imagine it was drinking whatever negative emotion that could be lapped off a Necron. He blew air through his ruined oral cavity and doused the deceiver's face in reactor fluid. The shard sneered and tore its tendrils outward, ripping open Trazyn's buckled chestplate, yanking his ribcage almost out of its housing. He felt something large wrench free from his body cavity and scrape on his broken ribs as it was dragged out. Trazyn's vision greyed, the intensity of the wound unquantifiable to his internal senses. It was like he'd been set afire from within, eaten by acid, mangled by a mining drill. He had to hold on, needed to stay conscious. Focus. The tendril around his neck forced his head downward, straining against his resisting vertebral servos so that he could see what the deceiver had taken from him. Tight in the electric coils lay a fluid-slicked oblong cylinder of 4 chambers. Cabling and hoses trailed off it, many of the tubes ending in shredded stumps from its violent exit from his system. Crystal viewports, discolored by fluid, radiated a cool blue glow, like sunlight shining through glacial ice. Trazyn was looking at his own central reactor. The coil squeezed, rupturing the core, deforming the casing and snapping the rods inside. It hurt, more pain than even a mortal body could sense, but he did not need to hold on much longer now. The lights in Trazyn's oculars went out. The deceiver purred in enjoyment, enraptured, savouring, and the obliterator crashed full force into the side of its head. Trazyn had timed the blow perfectly, casting his consciousness into his oncoming surrogate so swiftly the deceiver had not time to register him as a threat. Gods, after all, do not end their reveries due to a mere Lich-Guard charging them. The deceiver slid sideways through the air. One fire-sheaved horn snapped and dribbling antimatter that dissolved the floor wherever globs of it fell. At the edge of his perception, Trazyn saw the Master Shard stretch its mouth wide like a devouring snake and bellow in sonorous agony.
Yes, I know,
Trazyn said.
Whoever made this seems not to have liked your kind.
He advanced on the wounded Shard, swinging his obliterator back and forth like a pendulum, watching it flinch at the whoomph sound the artifact made as it cut the ether, each passage leaving meteor trails of tainted emerald light in its wake. The deceiver crossed its arms and threw them at the floor, splintering the black stone into fractals, like the skin of a broken mirror. As Trazyn approached, he saw triangular pieces sinking into the bottomless dimensional pit, tumbling down into the blackness. Several unfortunate Lich-Guard and warriors, locked in single-minded combat, toppled with the fractured pieces of flooring, their wrestling bodies shattering into abstract geometric patterns that mixed arms, legs, heads, and torsos. Enemies were torn apart and mixed together as they fell endlessly into a godless and sterile realm between realities. Trazyn cast a stasis field at the rift and walked across the jagged puzzle pieces of flooring that remained, his obliterator held low like a hunting spear. Then, with only the short warning of his perception suite, he saw a figure sliding across the floor to his right. It was the second Deceiver Shard. He leapt across the last of the rift, took a guard stance, and prepared to make his next blows tell. For the first time since the War in Heaven, a single Necron would face 2 Catan. They loomed over him, mask-like features sculpted into visages that sneered and grinned all at once. Necrodermis forms glistening, winding cloths drifting in spirals from the unnatural wind of the fractal dimension, finger and toenails growing hooked and long. The moment, a singularly heroic one, was interrupted by an interstitial message.
"Trazyn!"
Orokin signaled.
"We are reaching critical stage. Our forces cannot hold. They are breaking, and you cannot stand against 2 shards."
"No," signaled Trazyn,
"but I did lure them to the same spot."
Orokin saw the opportunity, seized it. They were losing, that was true. Their forces reduced to almost 20% of initial combat effectiveness. But the monumental casualties were also freeing up neural capacity as he disconnected from sectors that were either lost or so deeply committed orders were unnecessary. There was no managing this chaos now. It was simply chaos. On the left, the flayed ones had withdrawn, unable to make headway against the vicious hammering of the Militarum heavy weapons platoon. There was no cover here, nowhere to stalk. As he looked, a guardsman fell, scythed down by a Deathmark's beam.
"Handmaster!"
he signaled. Counteract that fire. Redeploy left flank grid 716. It is time to solve this nuisance.
Confirmed, worthy master.
The death marks were a problem. Two of Trazin's surrogate bodyguards had already thrown themselves in front of shots meant for Orokin, or rather, Orokin had run back time and ordered them to do so. On the right, the Lich Guard and Corrupted Immortals had nearly cancelled each other's force effectiveness. Mutual destruction. In other circumstances, the Immortals might have pulled back and fired, keeping out of range of the Lich Guard, luring them forward to open and turn the flank. But Orokin was too savvy to allow it, and the Star Gods were so intent on advancing that this strategic deviation had not occurred to them. Yet, the true battle still raged in the air, where burning ghost arcs pulled broadside, scouring each other with Gauss weapons. Screaming in between them like light insects, dived and wheeled the tomb blades. "Arc Alpha," Orokin ordered. "Tack about 21 degrees starboard and fire flare batteries. Get between me and that doomsday cannon." One doomsday arc remained, wounded, afire, functional, still in enemy control. But with the lessening mental demands, Orokin had finally cracked the Guardian's neural network. Meaning he was finally in a position to do something about that arc. Before, he could only scry through the oculars of these plebeians. Now, with a great degree of concentration and by releasing all other attachments, he could ride one of the Guardian's systems, guiding their hands. Not full control, as Trazyn did with his surrogates, but a crucial nudge here or there. He sent a last order to the Arc Flotilla, to close and board, a combat package he'd coded on the fly, then closed his ocular and rushed his consciousness into the pilot of a tomb blade. The disorientation of riding the pilot's system mid-flight nearly snapped him back into his body. A rushing dive carried the pilot down between two furiously dueling ghost arcs, their flare batteries stripping hull molecules as the warriors within traded fire. Disassembling beams cut the air around him as the craft zipped through the crossing fire, Orokin making his influence known by activating the Shadow Loom countermeasures that briefly flashed the craft through a shade dimension, its hull disintegrating, then reappearing in successive puffs of coal-black smoke, its flight path weaving in and out of the dimensional plane like a strand of stitching travels through cloth. Amber beams cut through the interrupted flight path, passing where the tomb blade would have been if it had behaved like a logical craft.
"Orokin!"
Trazyn signalled.
"They're right on me."
"Coming!" snarled Orokin. "I've never been a pilot before." The blade passed through the curtain of fire and got underneath the arcs, its underslung particle beamer pointing directly at the floor, as if the pilot planned to slam the craft into the flagstones. But just as Orokin reached forward into the pilot's programming to evade, the governing algorithm slammed the craft sideways, the floor sliding beneath the pilot's face as it vectored a 90-degree turn without banking. Impossible aerodynamics. It was a maneuver that would jar a mortal pilot so badly that its circulation would cease and its fluid-cased brain would mash itself against the inside of the skull. But that resilience came at a cost. The pilot had no initiative. It flew on pre-programmed algorithms, merely selecting different attack and evasion packages as the occasion suited. Little wonder the swarms of tomb blades were killing each other at a near constant ratio. They were like a logic engine, forced to play against itself on a Nemesis board. But not anymore. Orokin reached out, nudging the controls through the pilot's wired-in hands. He rolled the craft over, triggered its beamer so the stream of antimatter particles raked the bottom of a corrupted ghost arc, the distressed atoms detonating as they contacted the necrodermis. The maneuver slashed a burning diagonal below the enemy arc, cutting its helm so it slewed out of true, flare battery drifting away from the arc it was battling, a ship that, reacting to its new combat program, came about and burned engines on a ramming course. Orokin shot the tomb blade vertical, building a random zigzag algorithm that, based on a rough analysis of the battle's firing patterns, would foil the enemy blades by substituting random variables. He rolled the craft experimentally, thinking how it was like being a gyroscope. At least, it would be if gyroscopes flew random patterns that dodged in and out of reality. The crazed flight path gave him a glimpse of the dueling arcs below. He got a flash of the Guardian arc, their last, ploughing into its corrupted rival amidships, snapping the big rib spars and locking the two craft. Guardian warriors, nimble and arachnid-like, pounced onto the corrupted arc, firing flares into its bottled-up crew and passengers, laying in with their axe bayonets. Lock warning. "Bastard," he said with the pilot's mouth. Orokin triggered the shadow loom and dipped into the cloak of the shade dimension, emerging 2 Kut distant and heading in a different direction. He rolled around, running calculus chains through his mind, finding patterns, running projection models, sensing futures as the crazed pursuer danced through the ribbed vaults of the ceiling, first below him, then above, vectoring towards and away, moving diagonally, then down, always the Gauss beams stinging out towards Orokin. He heard them sizzle as they passed. He looked for its next move, judged, fired, missed. A Gauss shot skimmed across one of his flight veins, eating away a panel that started reforming itself. They were like 2 divination dice shaken in a cup, ricocheting through the air, the only constant being the chin guns that were always orientated to point at each other. Orokin scanned his Tomb Blade's programming to identify the enemy's flight package. He hit on a hyperfractal equation that fit, and designated a firing solution aiming at empty air, countermanded the automated targeting program that tried to dismiss the shot as an erroneous discharge. "Got you!" He fired. The enemy blade triggered its shadow loom, vanishing into a cloud of darkness. The particle beam stung it when it had only half emerged from the interdimensional cloud, tearing through the cable housing that connected pilot to blade. Antimatter detonated as it hit the dorsal arch, throwing the pilot forward into its controls, the orbiculum face display shattering as it slammed into the console. The blade dropped into an uncontrolled descent, falling in a zigzag pattern, the governing flight program still throwing it in random directions as it careened into the floor. A blossom of amber energy, clear and bright as embalming fluid, erupted from the impact and washed over the few Lichguard and corrupted immortals who still struggled below. Orokin had no time to watch. He cast the new targeting program to his remaining Tomb Blades, hoping it gave them an edge, and burned engines towards the center of the battle line, where the whole of the enemy force, flares, Lichguard and 2 Catan shards, were piling into the press of a chaotic melee around a single, tiny figure. Trazyn.
"Insect."
The Deceiver Shard brought its fists together over its head, the superheated necrodermis of the fingers fusing before they hammered down at him. Trazyn threw his obliterator up in a guard, catching the blow, his tactical program noting with a detached sort of terror how the weapon half bent under the shock. Kinetic force knocked through his frame, joint servos sparking under the compacting stress. He blew backward, sensing smoke, and realized it was coming from his own overtaxed body. "Orokin, I can't keep this up." The second deceiver was, if anything, stronger than the first, or perhaps its dominance over the fabric of the universe was more directly useful for combat. Every blow Trazyn threw at it missed. Every dueling strike learned from his library of combat manuals hit empty air. Each guard position was broken by raking claws that cooked his necrodermis. Trying to hit it was like spearing a fish. A dimensional field displaced its image, making it appear in places it was not. "Tricky little star god, aren't you?" Around them, the rest of the combat continued to boil. He saw flares in the melee now, Corrupted warriors, immortals, its loyal complement of guardians, outnumbered and falling. The deceiver had lured him into combat, planning to decapitate one of the Guardian's 2 commanders.
"Not today,"
Trazyn said, channeling energy into his wounds, feeling them drip with corpuscent as they suited.
"You will not leave my gallery alone in this universe."
Sensing encroachment, he wheeled and struck out to the other side, the first deceiver shard darting back from the luminous headpiece of the Obliterator even as it guttered, damaged by the last blow. It, at least, was nervous about approaching the furious weapon.
"Young, foolish thing,"
it said with 2 mouths, the words coming through the injured shard with an eerie delay.
"It is arrogance itself, taking a name like Infinite. Only the divine are infinite."
It floated above the remains of 3 dead surrogates, each mangled or charred in death so gruesome Trazyn had evacuated their forms rather than experienced them. They were his last in the battle line. Only the 2 in reserve around Orokin remained.
"Like all of your kind,"
the shard continued,
"you mistake mere deathlessness for immortality. Any rude object can endure the millennia. A tool, a rock, a dead probe, crashed on a distant planet. Durability does not make a thing immortal. True immortality requires a soul."
It reached out with its long-fingered hands, mimed gripping at Trazyn, and pulled downward. Trazyn staggered backward, dragged by the time-splinter cloak, as if invisible fists had yanked it down to the Blackstone to render him helpless. Preservation sequences took over, and he threw himself forward, trying to stay upright. He realized his mistake when the tension suddenly ended with the sound of fracturing monowire and scattering tiles. The cloak. He tried to access it, analyze possible timelines, found he could not.
"Old fool," he thought. "Yes, old fool. How apt. That is what put you in this form, is it not? Pain and age. Worry that your failing flesh could not support such a keen intelligence, that your biological system was corrupting the genius of your mind, as if the mind were not part of the body, as if mind and soul were the same. Now, child, you are no different than the dead objects preserved in your gallery."
Trazyn rerouted the power on his damaged Obliterator, tried to straighten the haft so the bent staff no longer compressed the power rods. The headpiece flickered, energy coil irregular, and he thrust while the weapon was empowered. The second shard twisted its hand in air, and Trazyn felt his left arm dislocate, crushing inward, deforming, crumpling with a wail of tortured metal. Inoperable, mangled. He opened a dimensional pocket, thrust a hand into it, and emerged with a tesseract labyrinth just as the thing breathed a word of power, overloading his knee servos and dropping him to the Blackstone like a supplicant. In his perception suite, he saw that the warriors were well and truly defeated. Corrupted Necrons, the mind slaved and the Flayer cursed, loomed at his back. He could feel their subservient craving, their wish to execute the coming order to pull him apart.
"What have you there?"
The deceiver flicked a finger, forcing Trazyn to extend his hand and reveal the labyrinth.
"More body shells, I expect."
Instead of a cutting answer, Trazyn merely shrugged and activated the labyrinth. Claws emerged from the depths of the prismatic glare. Chapter 6. Many times in history, planetary populations stood against invaders, but only on Serenade did all of history marshal to fight a common foe. Records of the Serenade War, Tablet 12. Strange air, strange light, cold stone underfoot, mandible feelers tasting the flat tang of metal bodies and motes of fried particles. Energy weapons. No connection to the mind. Pheromone scent of brood children absent. The alpha pure strain came out of the light running. To run was to live. Sprinting made it harder for the enemy to hit you. Covered ground quickly. Pressed the shock attacks that overwhelmed planets and brought them into the biome, to be made into energy for the great fleets. The Alpha did not think this. She knew it. Coded into her genetics was the knowledge that to run was to live, and to stand was to die. And she knew that when a pack found itself surrounded, ringed on all sides by hostile organisms that were not yet of the mind, there was one option. Attack. So she came out of the light running, unconcerned that a moment before she and her pack had been charging into a hail of weapons fire in the bright sunlight. There was no past for an organism like her, only an eternal present, and a bone-deep knowledge that, by the laws of dominance, one always attacked the largest, fiercest organism first. She leapt for the humanoid organism that floated before her, triclaws extended to latch onto its flesh and bring it down with her weight. Barbed mouth-feelers splayed to wrap its throat and ravage the arteries that lay beneath the fragile skin. Its face showed a muscle configuration that her genetic memories did not associate with fear. That was all right. She would teach it fear, soon enough. Gene-stealers swarmed out of the labyrinth dimension, a river delta of chitin, talons, and hissing violence. They ploughed into the deceiver shards, dragging their bobbing forms down with the weight of their clutching bodies. Rending claws and sucking mouths tore rents in their necrodermis that bled with the aged light of long-digested stars. One shard, the wounded one, toppled under the growing pile of alien bodies. A detonation, and starlight fountained upward from the mass, throwing blackened alien corpses in every direction, energy blasting upward like a volcano. The mere wash of it frosted Trazen's oculars with atomized chitin. At first, he thought the Catan had unleashed some new power. Then he realized it was diffusing. Its essence was temporarily spent into the ether. One of the parasites had pierced its necrodermis and unleashed the ethereal being bound within, dissipating the energy it had taken billions of years to gather, sipping from stars and devouring light. The result was like a plasma charge, and Trazen had only survived because the gene-stealers had taken the blast. Trazen scrambled backward on his crushed limbs, watching as the upwelling of alien parasites packed the empty space in the center of the enemy army, and now, unable to reach the shards, began sweeping sideways to engage the corrupted Necrons ringing the combat. One scuttled for Trazen, its tortoise-shell back gleaming bright viridian under the undulating light of a Gauss flare beam. Trazen kept pushing backward, sending a signal from his damaged system, looking for a connection to one of the surrogates in the back of the antechamber. A bony, five-fingered hand dragged him forward by one malfunctioning leg. Another sank deep into the ropey inner systems of his chest. 3 long sickles closed on his face, one puncturing an ocular. Connection. Trazen fled his surrogate body, glad to be gone from this battle of gods and monsters. Orokin screamed in above the combat, watching the great mass of corrupted Necrons drawn towards the alien parasites like a black hole. The Catan had baited Trazen forward, and he'd baited them in turn, and created a masterful distraction. The Master Shard levitated behind the lines, floating, controlling, mind sunk in the concentration of maintaining so many mind slaves. Orokin ran a divination, constellation maps wheeling in front of him as he flew in M-dimensional paths, hoping to evade notice. The future was hard to see here, more than a few seconds ahead, almost impossible in fact. Trazin's little collections, wrenched out of their own period and placed in another, made the sands of time run strange. Because he had no idea of their location, he could not build a proper zodiac. He was flying by luck and instinct, not calculating, acting, indeed much more like the reckless Trazin. And he had got so far in doing so. He cast a ranged divination and lined up his angle of attack. Charged the particle beamer to maximum power. Range in 3, 2, 1. The deceiver's eyes snapped open, looking directly at him. Orokin could feel the eyes boring into him from half a league away, could feel them looking straight through the pilot he was riding and into the innermost parts of his circuitry. He fired. The beamer lanced out, its passage nothing but a wavering heat haze of the containment field for the particle stream. Orokin held the attack vector, wanted to keep the beam directly on target as long as possible, cranked his chronosense down to make sure. He would fire the batteries empty, then ride the tomb blade directly into the deceiver. The antimatter stream struck the deceiver's broad chest, the impact point flaring up a candle flame like a welding laser hitting steel. In his slowed chronosense, Orokin saw the deceiver block the beam with its palm, as though it were an unwelcome shaft of sunlight. Then it folded its shining hand, running the burning stream over its knuckles, as it extended a single finger and aligned it with the beam. Artificially slowed, Orokin saw the beam reversal coming, rushing back up the chain of antimatter and towards the tomb blade. A purple spark fizzling up towards the craft like a burning fuse. He ejected his consciousness right before the blade tore apart in an implosion of unreality, the antimatter beam rupturing the weapon's muzzle and cooking off the particle hopper. Orokin kicked his spirit algorithm out of the pilot just before overload, wanting to collect whatever data he could on the particle stream. "An energy projection," he said, banishing his Phosglyph panels and dropping to the Blackstone. "It has necrodermis. I do not envy the cryptech whom it convinced to forge it a shell, but the greater part of the body is energy. It leaks out like reactor radiation, but it's weak." "Perhaps from the rear lines, Astromancer," grumbled Trazin, superheating and reshaping the haft of his obliterator. "It did not feel weak face to face." "Weakness is relative," Orokin said, casting zodiacs in the air, their overlapping circles, parabolas and grids forming a mosaic before him. "The weakest tomb scarab is quite mighty to a rodent, but the point remains. Gauss and antimatter weapons do little to it. Whatever trans-dimensional aura surrounds it neutralizes the energy. Your obliterator is our best weapon, as is anything that can damage the necrodermis shell directly. Thus," Orokin gestured at the whirling melee before them, calling up a scry panel that showed, in painful slowness, the second shard emerging from a mounting swarm of gene-stealers, each slash in its body spewing sickly fire that atomized the attackers in blasts of plasma. "You've cast a chronostasis field," nodded Trazin, "so we can plan a strategy." "We have a strategy?" asked Orokin. "Was that what was happening when you dashed in, leaving me to run an army?" "I heard it." "You did, as did I. Stung the arrogant bastard out of its reverie. Made it realize it couldn't hide safe behind the lines while it buried us under expendable bodies. But that means we have made it more desperate. It will—" A shockwave rocked the chamber, deforming the flagstones so they tilted and reared, buckling out from the master shard at the epicenter. In the vaults, great buttresses cracked and tumbled. The energy wave hit Orokin's field before the seismic shock bursting it. From distorted slowness, all was movement and noise. "It's coming," said Orokin. The Master Shard rushed forward so quickly its body tilted diagonally, metal sculpted chest and raking claws forward as it dived towards the Genestealers. It grew as it came, tripling in size, energy aura expanding around the Necroderma's body until the physical form of the being only existed in the core of the energy ghost, a metal heart that mimicked the energy projection's every move. A god, a transcendent god, landed among mortals. The Deceiver reached out, and Genestealers withered, their mortal bodies experiencing mass cell death that crumbled their heads like old fruit. Ichor spilled in waterfalls from their joints. They tried to run, even the great mental binding of their swarm god not enough to override their instinct for preservation. One hand, huge now, reached out and snatched up the starlight-leaking body of the remaining Deceiver Shard. It screamed, twisting and flailing in the grip of the larger piece of what was, after all, the same great being. The Master Shard bit down on its cast-off shard, teeth sinking into its sculpted thorax muscles and sucking at the energy that leaked out, its amber form deepening from a wan yellow to a rich orange. "Trazyn," said Orokin, "throw everything you have." Turning away from its cannibalistic feast, the Deceiver looked directly at them and rose. Arms dropped, palms towards them, esoteric symbols and long-devoured stars dancing in its hands and haloing its head. And it came for them, the crashing tide of its thrall army at its back. Broken Necrons rising again, reassembling, dragging their bodies into the onrushing horde. Tracer streams from 2 heavy bolters, all that was left of the Serenade heavy platoon after the Deathmarks had done with them, spat anemic fire into the onrushing storm of metal bodies. Trazyn realized it was down to them. 2 Necrons, no longer feeling as immortal as they once had, standing against an army. That is, until Trazyn grabbed a Tesseract Labyrinth and began releasing the reserves. Purus the Lamanite stepped out of the gossamer strands of unreality, his goggle-capped eyes taking in the oncoming rush of metal creatures. His lips curled at their ugliness, fingers drifting to the amulet at his neck, feeling the 2 worms chasing each other in a state of equilibrium. Artless, that is what they were, sculpted not from the elegant materials of organic matter, but from dead and immutable metal. They did not belong on this planet, this sainted world that would soon be visited by the Redeemers from above, arriving in their exquisite sky islands of biomatter. But the sacred swarm could not be called when its prize contained such pollution. He slammed the butt of his injector goad pump on the ragged floor, whistling to call his creations. Colossal forms bounded out of the light, slab-like muscles bunched as they dragged hammers and crude axes shaped from eye-beams. They looked at him below ridged brows, tongues too long and sinewy for their short, humanoid palates. The eyes, golden, waited for orders. Purus the Lamanite swept his goad towards the foe, and the aberrants tore off at a loping run, thick knuckles speeding them along on the fractured floor. Malformed heads lowered to ram, hooting as they went. "Forward!" he shouted, spiking their bent backs with the goad as they passed, each strike accompanied by the hydraulic hiss of an injection. "For the 3-armed king!" Boot-clicker Zugkruk could not believe his good fortune. A moment before, they'd been tearing through the internals of a robot Hulk, cheering and killing in the inertialess environment of zero gravity. Which was a good trick, what? But getting a bit floaty for his taste. His boys could only kick about, tearing up tins for so long before it got a little dull. Novel, yeah, but
Not a proper scrab.
Besides, what good was it being a storm boy if everyone could fly? Hurt his pride a bit, it did. And in his bulbous fungus-pumping heart, like any good orc, Bootclicker always longed for more enemies. But this big wave of tinnies, that was a scrap an orc could sink his teeth into, not to mention his chopper and boot. He took a deep breath, bellowed the charge.
Come on, boys! Let's show these tin gigs what!
But then he saw the rush of corkscrew contrails heading away, heard the excited roars of his comrades, and realized they were already gone.
Well, can't blame 'em for being game,
he grumbled. Then he lit his rocket engine, wrapped his helmet for luck, and rushed into the dark air of the vault, firing wildly with his slugger. Energy beams lashed the air around him. As he reached the top of his arc and dropped towards the mass of whirling death, steel-capped boots positioned to crush the enemy, he lost himself in a feeling of rage-filled bliss. To his right, he saw a blister of rainbow light blossom in the far corner of the big room, wavy ghost tentacles unfolding to reveal the gruff steel face of Morg, or possibly Gork. The Gargant had arrived. An energy beam severed his slugger arm, and Bootclicker grinned. There was nowhere in the world he'd rather be. Orokin took in the mad scene. To his right, a pack of deformed hybrid bioforms slammed into the roiling tide of mixed Necrons, chopping at the oncoming wave with bludgeons and mining tools. He saw one, twice as tall as an average human and wielding a street sign like a glaive, batter a Lich Guard down, slap a warrior aside, and drive the now bare pole into a flayed one's chest like a spear. Behind them, a trio of battered destroyers slid over the floor, their poise and calculated murder urge unaffected by the chaos. They raked the oncoming corrupted with cool precision, scything them down in lines like an industrial beam cutter. To his left, a commissar drove a Serenade Maritime Company forward, lasguns spitting red into the metal mass. Their shrieks overlapped until the entire force appeared to be speaking with a single deadly voice, their fire lighting up the front ranks of the advancing corrupted, splashing their metal bodies until they radiated like metal heated in the forge. The company, clad in only cloth-covered helmets and flak armor, was making a wall with their bodies.
They made it off Serenade, Trazyn shrugged. Pick them up later.
Orcs howled and shouted overhead, their dirty smoke paths crisscrossing as they lost all unit cohesion in the excitement. 3 of them had landed on a doomsday arc and were currently yanking the helmsman apart, tearing him out of his command cradle piece by piece. Another, giving a guttural scream of triumph, dived directly for the enormous form of the Master Shard.
"Suicidal idiot,"
said Orokin.
"Undoubtedly,"
said Trazyn, activating another labyrinth.
"But not the long white missile on his pack."
The deceiver swept a hand towards the Storm Boy, knocking him tumbling with an energy wave so he crashed into the mass of corrupted bodies at its feet, along with the live hunter-killer missile propelling him through the air. The anti-tank ordnance detonated, rocking the chamber and throwing up bodies in a gout of pulverized blackstone that fountained skyward, hunks of ancient masonry raining down on the attackers. Then the Gargant opened up, its low-slung belly gun thudding as it lobbed shells into the mass, unable to resist the tight grouping of enemies. It stamped forward, breaking flagstones wherever it lumbered, and swept its massive buzzsaws down to chew through a ghost arc that appeared to be on Trazyn and Orokin's side. Tomb blades surrounded it like biting gnats, and it waved its clumsy arms, blasting flames that sent 2 tumbling out of the air. The flanks faltered, but the centre still came on, the Master Shard's cosmic thought form towering over the crested flood of bodies. Trazyn threw the last labyrinth. It rolled toward the deceiver, fountaining pinwheels of etheric glare as it expanded into a rolling light storm. And inside the storm, shadows raced towards the foe. They came with the song of clawed feet on tile, the tattoo of battle. It formed the rhythmic thread on which they coordinated their war chants. The Raptor riders tore from the rift at full charge, losing not a single step in their new environment. Their knee-to-knee formation didn't waver as the wild host plunged towards the star god. Agile mounts pitched forward, necks extended. Feather cloaks billowed behind them. Scrimshawed bone charms rattled. Tattooed faces, decorated with sigils that Trazyn recognized as the Serenade Spiral, were set in expressions of determined stoicism. Trazyn had worn a death mask for 65 million years. He knew one when he saw it. Behind them, the Carnosaur clomped out of the light, stretched its body low, and roared. The feral sound, enough to check even a few Militarum soldiers that, fighting their mind-shackled scarabs, looked to their flank with eyes wide. On its back rode the Farseer, willow-thin face half covered by the mask of an unfamiliar god, and mother-of-pearl armor reflecting the battle light. Pink hair gathered into a topknot, unstirred by her 10 millennia of waiting. "I told you, Trazyn," said a voice, vibrating his auditory transducer, "that this world sang for your blood. You did not listen. But listening was not your fate. It was your fate to continue digging, and our fate to perish here, against the horror you unleashed." The Carnosaur sprinted forward with another bellow, bone-spiked tail slashing back and forth as it tilted into the charge. Atop it, the sorceress wove arrows from the skin of the universe, sending fuchsia bolts of warp energy into the hulking star god. "Make our sacrifice worth it." Wraithbone lances drove into metal bodies, discharging bound spell energies that rippled out through the corrupted metal forms, buckling exoskeletons and shorting out reactors. They drove into them as a wedge, opening a delta of space for the Carnosaur to lay into the army. The beast barked with aggression and plucked 2 struggling Necrons from the mass, crunching them with its reinforced jaws. Reactor fluid, glowing neon in the darkness, leaked between the 9-inch saw teeth. A flayed one leapt onto its flank, climbed towards the Farseer, and she danced to her feet on the riding platform, decapitating it with a neat sweep of her glaive. The shuriken pistol embedded in her decorative bangle wickered shots into a second corrupted, who'd clambered up one of the great lizard leather saddle straps. She called a song, and the massive lizard whipped around in a circle, throwing the climbers and lashing its spiked tail through the mass of Necrons at its feet, pulverizing several, crushing others beneath its claws. A synaptic disintegrator beam burned one of the lizard's haunches, and it gave a shriek of pain, lowering its head and using its bony crest to buck the offending deathmark into the air. The Deceiver Shard pulled a haloed fist back and brought it down on the prehistoric mount, its crashing impact only stopped by a hastily deployed psychic shield that the Farseer conjured with outstretched fingers. Orokin turned from the fascinating scene, glyph panels forgotten. "What is your next plan?" "Nothing. I have nothing. Can you still not take your empowered form?" "The stars are ill. There is no energy to draw upon." Trazyn paused, pointing to the radiant Catan. "What about that?" "That?" he scoffed. "That would burn me to cinder the moment I opened my collection ports. I would need to become empowered merely to approach it. Only a god can combat a god. I need to draw power first." Trazyn was silent a moment, watching the enormous Catan pound at the magic ward. Cracks began to web the psychic shield. It would not hold. He looked into his dimensional pocket, scrying the space. There was only one thing remaining there. A thing he had stolen. A thing that, were the old folklores true, once raised a god. Trazyn dipped his hand into the pocket and withdrew the Eldari gemstone. The cut surface gleamed, warm to the touch. It was the oldest thing Trazyn owned, centerpiece of the War in Heaven gallery, the last object he possessed from the dawning of the Necrons. Were it gone, it would be an irretrievable loss. Another door to the ancient past closed. Was the future worth that? He hoped so.
See what you can draw from this.
Orokin took the gem, waved a hand over it to cast a spectromantic analysis. Dead gods, he breathed, caressing the stone and folding it into his hands. Orokin closed his ocular, pressing the gem between his palms as if praying. His energy collection ports opened like rose petals. Through the gaps in his fingers, Trazyn could see a red pulse beginning to beat, a light spectrum so powerful, so alien to the Necrons, that it made him uncomfortable to look at it. Orokin's reactor glow increased, boiling outward like a green sun. Trazyn heard the reactor kick at quadruple cycle, the glow that leaked behind Orokin's closed ocular hatch, bleeding light that smoked in the cold air. And then the hands snapped together, crushing the gem. Orokin caught fire, a red inferno that devoured his form, licking upward in bright magenta flames that curled inward, drawn towards the open collection ports on his shoulders. Trazyn had to step back, shielding his face. His fury about the willful destruction was temporarily quenched by fear. Fear for the Astromancer. Fear for himself.
"Orokin!"
he shouted. But Orokin was already gone, a bolt of lightning streaking through the chamber. Trazyn rolled over, realizing the blast had knocked him on his back. His vision blurred from the discharge of energy, his own central reactor deploying countermeasures to keep from overloading from the power surge he'd experienced, even standing next to Orokin. The battle line was no longer a fight. It was a bonfire. And Trazyn knew he had not witnessed Orokin take on his energy form. He'd just seen an apotheosis. Orokin was, if only briefly, like unto a god. Orokin expected Transcendence to feel powerful, thought the energy of the cosmos would throng through his system like floodwater through a dry canyon. He'd wanted to be mighty, shot through with the overspilling pride and vigor of the gods. It did not feel like that. Instead, all the other beings seemed so small, petty, knotted into the inconsequential entanglements of their finite existence. Pain, pride, fear, excitement, love. All of them meant nothing to the wheeling, colliding systems of the galaxy that he could now see in his mind's eye. Even his own petty obsession with the path of things to come, so all-consuming, was but the dream of an insect. What purpose, being a diviner, when one saw that there was no such thing as past and future? To a cosmic being, one that saw the curves in the very skin of reality, it was clear that time was but a delusion, a perverted twisting of the eternal present, meant to order the lives of those that needed to plant and sow, to guess at how much of their meagre lifespans remained. It no more resembled reality than a paper map did a continent. Melancholy overtook him, thinking of all the time he'd wasted, quarrelling with his rival about past and future. He could not recall the being's name or face, but an echo of the sly voice remained. No matter. Even the most formidable beings from his mortal days would be dust long before Orokin thought to dwell upon them again. He gazed down at the dim soul flames, guttering and going out in the battle below, tried to feel pity for them, and instead could only summon contempt. Pathetic. All of them struggling. And for what? To save their pitiful civilizations, to spread their influence, to defeat foes. Necron, Eldari, human, orc, Tyranid, bathing in blood in the misapprehension that the universe belonged to them. None of them saw the truth. The great universal zodiac, the turning wheel of fortune that brought each race around and around, sometimes rising, sometimes falling. The Eldari's time at the top was long over, and yet they fought as if they could reverse the great turning. The humans were following them, their period of apex nearly over. Tyranids and orcs, when they had their time at the crest, would likely not appreciate it. And the Necrons. Orokin felt such scorn for them, with their impoverished shadow souls, so dead and stagnant. It embarrassed him how he'd struggled to secure their future, that they had survived the wheel's descent and were rising again. In truth, he suddenly understood why the Catan had burned the Necron Tyr in the biotransference forges and gorged themselves on the souls. Felt glad for it. Only wished he'd been there to sate himself. For the only thing he felt more than contempt was hunger. Hunger for life energy that these sapped metal bodies could not provide. Yet, in the centre of the candle flame battle line, he could see one that had energy to spare. A blazing figure. A Catan. The transcendent energy being that was Orokin swept low, ethereal body, prismatic and shifting in hue, sweeping through arcs and tomb blades, gathering strength by skimming the top of the Necron ranks, lapping whatever small energies he could from their dull lights. They fell in his wake, lifeless and depowered. A large thing startled and snapped at him, teeth closing on part of his drifting energy shroud. He kicked out and pulverized the dumb beast, crushing every bone in its thick body and sending it flying like a toy. A rider, brighter than the rest, tumbled from its back and snuffed out. The transcendent being cared not, for the blazing one stood in front of him. Its face, twisted into a look that a vestigial memory interpreted as amusement, could not hide the way its aura quailed as he approached. The blazing one leapt backward and swept a hand through the air, and in the transcendent being's new vision he saw that the enemy passed its forearm through the fabric of space-time and gathered a black hole around its wrist like a vambrace. A shining fist, radiating so much power that the transcendent being nearly doubled over in a craving, blasted a stream of compressed matter that contained the whirl of galaxies long swallowed. Yet, millions of years of study had taught the being to manipulate the ether. Only a lack of sufficient energy had constrained him. The transcendent being once known as Orokin tore a hole in the universal skin, a portal through which could be seen a star field and a collection of planets, and wielded it as a shield. Compressed matter tore through the rent in space, wiping 6 planets out of existence. Inhabited worlds? It did not matter. The transcendent being released the wormhole and dived at the blazing one, tearing at it with hands he'd fashioned into long grasping claws. The two beings rose into the vaults, locked together, biting and clawing, burning the energy output of several industrial worlds for each second of combat. Each wound bled the furnace of creation into the physical plane, each shot of star stuff gobbled by the famished vampire that had once been Orokin the Diviner. Hands dripping with boiling necrodermis, the transcendent being tossed aside anything that felt solid, noting with disinterest how the chunks he tore away and discarded formed into humanoid figures. The blazing one was pleading now, appealing to mercy, using words as if the transcendent being still had a mind that could interpret language. Words were, like mortality, a thing for lesser beings. This transcendent god no longer needed communication. But even so, he could guess what the Blazing One was thinking. The eyes, red and round as dead stars, were full of fear. Yet the face was still locked in its mask-like rictus grin. Or at least it was, until the transcendent being tore it off and plunged its long spider-like arms into the rich starlight within. Chapter 7.
Our kind have lived life as mortals, and then as immortals. And though the urge to return to the flesh is nearly universal, what will it be like when an eternal being is once again enshrouded in such temporary raiment? Can an immortal being become mortal without going mad?
Illuminator Xeras, Ruminations on Flesh and Spirit. Trazyn found the diviner in a corner, his battered legs drawn up to his chest, hands over his closed ocular. His entire frame, from headdress to lashing tail, had turned black. It was not ash or burn marks. The interdimensional energies had fused the shadows to his necrodermis.
Orokin, have you suffered damage?
There was no answer.
My dear Orokin.
Trazyn knelt and put a hand on his quaking shoulder plate.
"Don't touch me!"
The diviner wailed, trying to shrink back into the masonry.
"Don't touch me! Don't touch me!"
It's all right, friend, it's all right.
Trazyn held up his palms to show he was no threat.
You have been through a shocking transition, to be sure, but the danger is past, provided you are not suffering critical damage. I am scrying you for injury or malfunction.
Orokin said nothing, stared at the floor. Trazyn ran a diagnostic scry, palm hovering around Orokin's cranium longer than the rest of his body, careful not to intrude too far into the diviner's space.
Oh, thank your stars, Orokin. It's not too bad. Nothing irrecoverable. Few servos here and there, sundry damage to electrolocation systems. I wonder there is not more, given how much energy you channeled. And likely some engram corruption. You may lose memories for a time, but they will come back.
Is it gone?
Trazyn's mouth twitched, and he brought a tesseract labyrinth out of his dimensional pocket. Orokin shrank away.
You tore the deceiver to pieces, dear rival. You sucked the energy of each shard dry before casting it off, and I was there to catch them before they could collect enough energy to flee.
He tapped a finger on the labyrinth.
There are 5 of these, yes? So yes, it is gone.
Not...
Orokin's vocal emitters dissolved into a burr of static for a moment.
Talking about the deceiver, I want to know about the other one. Is it gone?
Trazyn paused.
I do hope so, Orokin. I do hope so.
Then he stood and offered a hand up.
Come now. We must rebuild the Tesseract Vault and put these labyrinths within. A vault inside a vault. Each shard in a separate labyrinth.
Orokin nodded and took the hand. His body was stiff. One leg would not bend, and Trazyn had to support him so that he could walk towards the ruined vault.
"We will leave the mysterious here, sealed inside," said Orokin, "so none can find this place again."
"Indeed," said Trazyn.
"And Trazyn—"
He stopped, looked at the archivist with an eye that Trazyn had just noticed was temporarily burned blind.
"Make me an oath, an honor pact, that neither of us will come here again."
He held out a forearm, fused to the point that it could not move at the elbow servo.
"Agreed,"
said Trazyn, gripping the forearm. The oath seal.
"The contents of this vault are too dangerous for anyone to possess."
Especially us, said Orokin, and ambled towards the ruined vault. To reach it, they would need to cross a mountain of corpses. Epilogue. Time is a weapon, like any other. If all else fails, I can simply wait for my enemies to rot. Orokin the Diviner. 7 doors secured the chamber. 7 doors with 7 seals. What was inside, after all, must never be let out. Canoptic wraiths quarried into the constructed strata of Solemnes for half a millennium to construct the great chamber, toiling in their millions without rest or refurbishment until they fell broken through the hard labour. Scarab swarms disassembled the fallen so their atoms could be repurposed anew in another worker drone. Cryptex shaped the Blackstone, created the spherical chamber that formed the living heart of Solemnes, a place of banishment and seclusion, a sphere within a sphere, that powered the prismatic galleries with the inexhaustible radiance of its evil. And Trazyn, overlord of Solemnes and archivist of the prismatic galleries, he who is called Infinite, went there as often as he could. Opened the 7 mausoleum gates with their 7 seals, stepped as close as he dared to the thing that hung within, its strong limbs shackled to the sides of its spherical prison, particle whips burning its wrists and ankles as they stretched the star god like a specimen on the dissection table.
"I see," said the Deceiver Shard, "that it is time for more questions. What shall we be returning to in this session, child Trazyn? Disposition of Catan Necron forces at the siege of Pathia? Proper taxonomy of emergent demon consciousnesses of the Imperium? What knowledge would you like to explore? And what are you willing to pay for it?"
Trazyn dipped a hand in his dimensional pocket, drew out what appeared to be a small homunculus, a being no longer than Trazyn's hand, that struggled in his grip. Radiance showed through the gaps in his fingers as he held the creature out for the Deceiver's inspection.
"It is small," said the Deceiver. "A shard of a shard. Never were the Nechailak known for stinginess."
"These are not simple to obtain," Trazyn said, "and we both know the risk I take in giving them to you at all."
"Yes,"
the Deceiver laughed. The deep sound of it screened out by Trazyn's filters, so it did not upset his vitals.
"We would not want me tearing through this prison, would we?"
Trazyn tightened his grip on the little shard splinter in his hand. The stunted Deceiver wriggled in his grasp, biting the impervious metal of Trazyn's fingers. It had little intelligence in it. Its component parts had been shattered so far. Yet still, he would need to up the security protocols. With every splinter of a shard he fed to the Serenade Deceiver, the more powerful it became. And, if it ever did slip its prison, he was unsure whether the banks of particle whips, doomsday cannons and pylons pointed at the broken god could actually destroy it without imploding all of Solemnes. He slipped the shard into a tesseract vault mounted on the back of a scarab and released it, watching the delivery scarab levitate up to the shining mouth of the star god. It opened its mouth and swallowed the vault whole, necrodermis crunching beneath its dagger teeth, solar energy flowing liquid over its lips and chin as the squealing Deceiver splinter burst and was absorbed into the hole. Trazyn felt, at times, a measure of guilt about having told Orokin there were only 5 shards, for keeping one for himself, entranced by the amount of power these ancient shards held.
The knowledge they had of the galaxy, a knowledge of things impossible. If he were Orokin, if he could travel backward, he would undo it. The deceiver became more powerful by the century, and it was inevitable that a reckoning would come. But that was not how history worked, he thought. We are shaped by past selves that come before, ghosts we would not recognize ourselves in if we met them. The Trazyn that had taken the shard from the tomb of Nepereth was no more, just as the Trazyn that had existed before biotransference was no more. Yet all their decisions, made in blindness, had culminated in where he was now. It was like Serenade, or Sephiroth, or Sephrus. Each iteration of the world shifting the culture and geography of those that came after it. Each society that rose knew little or nothing about how it had been shaped, or the predecessors who had forged it. Each street plan laid or seed drained was a decision made in the moment, but preserved for ages. Just as how past versions of himself, recalled only in the abstract, had placed him before this fallen god, who wished for nothing more than to destroy him. A god he could not banish or release, but one that, as long as he kept it bound, had its uses.
"An inadequate sacrifice,"
the deceiver said, long tongue curling over the plasma that dripped over its chin.
"What do you wish in return?"
"The Great Rift," said Trazyn. "I wish to know about its properties."
"Ah!"
The deceiver grinned.
"So you wish to close it?"
"No," said Trazyn. "I wish to enter it." The wheel of the universe turned. Zodiacs rose and fell, each race, each individual being having its day at the top, and each, one after another, dragged underneath by the relentless turn. Because that is what a wheel does, Orokin knew. It did not matter if it were mounted on a great battle tank or a stone milling grain in a primitive farmstead. A wheel crushes. And now it was his time at the top. He had read it in the constellations and heard the whisper of the cosmos. After centuries of waiting, the stars were, once again, right. It was Trazyn's turn to be ground into the dirt. He opened his dimensional pocket and withdrew his guide, played his network finger notes soft across the cranium. "Where is it?" he asked. "Deeper, my equal," responded the head of Datamancer Vashani. "At the core. The power flows, as always, from the core." She was not alive. Not truly. Her engram banks were active, and some language centers remained, but even mangled, there was so much knowledge to be unlocked in those deep neural spools. Trazyn had claimed that her remains had been sealed within the tomb, its eternity gates disassembled and atomized, locked away with her charges forever in an inaccessible oubliette dimension. He had lied, and slipped her cranium into his dimensional pocket while Orokin was still nearly insensate, recovering from his temporary ascension. He had taken advantage of the damage Orokin had visited on his own psyche in order to save both of them, kept the head on Solemnes to further his own researches. Orokin had broken their truce centuries ago to steal her back, nearly destroyed Solemnes doing it, spent a century scouring any taint of the deceiver's programming from her neurals, was amazed, even impressed, how deeply the Star God had hijacked her personality to tempt and guide Orokin into opening the tomb. And it was then that Orokin learned of the deceiver shard hidden at the core of Solemnes, powering the world via a Dyson sphere, rotating, ever rotating, like a galaxy, like a wheel. "The deceiver awaits us," sent Vashani. "My primary function is containment." "It is," agreed Orokin, "but a thing so powerful will be safer in our hands. don't you think? To remove it is to destroy this world of Solemnes. So much the better, smiled Orokin. I can remove this cataract from the eye of the universe and better divine the future. My primary function, she insisted, is containment. You can serve many functions, as can this Serenade Shard. Functions such as researching how to capture and sustain an energy form long-term. For though the callousness of omniscience had frightened him at first, he'd come to see what was too difficult to ken in the moment. Time is a wheel, and the wheel turns ever on. The universe cares not for Necrons or Eldari or humans or orcs. It cares not even for Catan or Old Ones. And the only way to escape the wheel was to become part of the wheel. And Orokin could do so, if he had enough cosmic power. The planets and constellations were sliding into place, and he felt their channels of connecting energy, their dark matter and gravitation superclusters, the connection of the universe that kept it in spin. He opened his collection ports and drank in the milky starlight of creation. Time is a wheel, and the wheel always turns, bringing a time for all things. And for Orokin, it was a time for revenge.